isn't gel, by the way. I just took a shower, so my hair looks wet. People think I always use gel because apparently my hair looks so good, but it's just natural genetic sexiness, you know? Should I get rid of that vodka bottle in the back? I'll leave it. So I saw The Disaster Artist, starring James Franco as Tommy Wiseau and Dave Franco as himself. I got to see an early screening, so let me discuss that for a bit, because everyone who sees an early screening of this movie has to discuss the wonderful experience they had, meeting some of the stars and the writers, and how they had a crowd of people who really wanted to be there because they saw The Room. There was actually a really great Q&A at the end of the screening, and I was given a lot of insight into the making of the movie. Paul Scheer was there, and one of the writers, and they discussed the movie in detail. The most interesting parts of the Q&A were, one, the first look thing started to play while they were talking. Second interesting thing we learned is that James Franco actually directed the movie in character as Tommy Wiseau. Third thing is, when the movie premiered, The Disaster Artist, I mean, Tommy Wiseau went on stage at the end of the screening and said, "I meant for Denny to be retarded." And then he called up the cast and crew one by one and asked them what they thought of The Disaster Artist, that movie they just worked on. So that's that. Now the movie. So Disaster Artist, if you don't know, is about the making of a film called The Room, which is considered one of the best bad movies ever made.
Don't worry about it, man. Right?
Don't touch me, motherfucker. Get out.
I would have to agree with that. I think The Room is one of the funniest movies ever made. I don't think I'm going to say anything that other people haven't been saying. I think it's a solid movie, for sure. This movie works basically because of James Franco. He produced it, he directed it, he's in it. He carries this whole movie on his shoulders. And without him, this movie doesn't work. His performance in this, which from the trailers I gathered, oh, it's going to be kind of a joke performance, but he really does capture Tommy Wiseau so well. I mean, they joke around, obviously, because Tommy Wiseau is just a ridiculous figure. But he does bring a lot of humanity and heart to the character. Everyone else in this movie ranges from serviceable to more than serviceable. But at the same time, no one else can even come close to Tommy Wiseau, because he's such an eccentric, odd character. I like the way this movie's shot for the most part. I heard some complaints about that. I thought it looked fine. Apparently it was shot on film, at least it looks like it. I mean, maybe they just put film grain over all the footage, but it looked like film. There were lots of long takes. It really had this realistic grittiness to it, as if we're one of the documentarians on set, watching the whole thing unfold. There's nothing visually interesting in this movie. Holy fuck, these sirens. Boston, can you stop committing crime? There's nothing visually interesting in this movie in terms of lighting, or cinematography, or set design, or costumes, or anything like that, aside from their willingness to be as accurate as possible to The Room. I mean, it works because for a movie as sterile and overlit and fake-looking as The Room is, this movie goes for a more naturalistic, 16mm grounded, raw look. And it works totally fine for this movie. It isn't overlit, which is a great thing. It doesn't look like a cheap TV show. And it's a really good script, too, for the most part. I mean, we'll get to the ending. Tommy Wiseau, as a character, has so much mystery to him. No one knows his age, or where he's from, or how he makes his money. Nor does it really matter in terms of the story at all. It adds so much to him, the fact that he's so mysterious, and like, who is this guy? Like I mentioned earlier, they recaptured scenes from The Room with such surgical precision. It was so cool to see. It's clear that they really cared about making this movie. Everyone involved loved The Room, and they really wanted to live out and recreate the experience with as much accuracy and humor and heart as possible. And that's why this movie is not nearly as good as it should be. This group of friends, James Franco, Dave Franco, Seth Rogen, all these other comedians, they loved this material so much that it feels like you're watching a fan film. Like, oh, we're a group of fans that really love The Room, and we're gonna recreate it and retell this story to people who don't know about it. And, I mean, as a fan film, it's good, but this story, this cultural phenomenon that The Room is, you could have made a masterpiece out of this. And I'm not even kidding. I mean, James Franco is ultimately the reason this movie works as well as it does, because he does such a great job portraying the character. but the rest of it is so uneven and unfocused. And if this film had a great director who was less concerned about, oh, I love The Room, and just more concerned with making a great movie about these two characters, Tommy Wiseau and Greg Sestero, and the cultural impact this dumb movie has had, it would have been so much better. The writer in the Q&A made comparisons to Boogie Nights and Ed Wood, and James Franco and the rest of the crew went into this movie with that mindset, that we're gonna take from these movies Boogie Nights and Ed Wood, and we're gonna do something along the lines of that, except Ed Wood and Boogie Nights are made by master filmmakers. Say whatever you want about Tim Burton now. Tim Burton in his prime was a damn good filmmaker, and Paul Thomas Anderson made Boogie Nights, you know. James Franco is no Paul Thomas Anderson, and he's no Tim Burton. Like, those are guys with a vision who clearly loved the material they were parodying. Paul Thomas Anderson clearly loved parodying those dumb porno movies from the 70s and 80s. And Tim Burton clearly had a love for Ed Wood and his films, and had admiration for his, you know, I'm all about the big picture kind of mindset. He definitely did. But at the same time, Paul Thomas Anderson and Tim Burton made a film that was theirs. They paid homage to the filmmaker while at the same time making a brilliant character study of what it takes to make art like this. And this movie doesn't even come close to Boogie Nights or Ed Wood, which are, in my opinion, some of the greatest movies ever made. The music in this movie is horrible. I don't know if it was their intention to have a really stock sounding... I just hate all these fucking movies that do this. There's so many great movies that are like, oh, we gotta throw in music for the pacing, and it sounds like stock music. It sounds like shit. I don't know if it was their intention, because The Room had bad stock music in it, but it had almost the same soundtrack as The Room. I think The Room actually had a better soundtrack, at least I remember it. Oh my god, was the music in this horrendous. I was just imagining this movie without the score, and it's so much better. I mentioned this before, James Franco's great, but the rest of the cast, including Dave Franco, just, they don't got it. They don't have that raw talent that James Franco has. That raw commitment he has to this role. I mean, James Franco directed the movie as Tommy Wiseau. Dave Franco is so not on that level. He's our viewpoint character, and we really don't get many scenes of him without Tommy there. There's one scene between Dave Franco and Alison Brie, his girlfriend, where Tommy isn't there, and that's it. Because this whole movie relies on James Franco so much that whenever it's not focused on him, it's just dull. Those scenes aren't as interesting, because Greg Sestero, at least the way they wrote him, isn't as interesting. And the actor they got, Dave Franco, is not interesting. I mean, he's fine, but I never bought him. I never went, that's Greg Sestero. I always went, that's Dave Franco doing a Greg Sestero impression. Not even an impression, he just seemed like he was being himself. The first third of this movie is great, because it does not rely on The Room at all. It's about two guys trying to make it in Hollywood, and the dialogue is fantastic, and the acting is solid. Then once this movie becomes about making The Room, it's not nearly as interesting. And the last 2/3 of this movie is that. It's a lot of scenes of, oh, we made The Room. Like, this is what happened when we were making this scene, and then Seth Rogen is the vessel for the audience going, why is he having sex with her belly button? And there aren't too many of those scenes. It didn't get annoying, but compared to I didn't know any of that shit in the first third of the movie. That they used to live in a different state, and then Tommy just happened to have a house in LA. Really, what this movie should have been, and the way most of these movies are structured, such as Ed Wood and Boogie Nights, is the first third is the before. We see these struggling artists trying to make it in Hollywood, and therefore we begin to like them because we see their struggle. Then the middle of the movie is about making the movie. And then the whole last third of the movie is the after. Once The Room comes out, what happens then? Because this movie really rushes along that part. They have one screening of The Room, everyone's laughing hysterically in a scene that feels so forced and phony and fake. And then Tommy Wiseau just realizes he made a cult classic. Like, that's not what happened. And having the second act low point of Tommy Wiseau realizing he made a bad movie and Greg Sestero being embarrassed by it, and then they go their separate ways. And then as the third act goes on, Tommy Wiseau begins to premiere it more and more and see this growing reaction to it. And Greg Sestero sees the same thing. I think that would have been so much more interesting to see, because that's the part we know the least about. We don't need to focus on how much of a production disaster The Room was. We know how much of a disaster The Room was. We can see that in The Room. And that goes along with the focus of this movie. It doesn't know what it wants to be about. It doesn't know if it's about a friendship, and this movie is there just in the background, or if this is a movie about making this terrible movie, and this friendship angle is only the emotional core of it. And then we have to rush along all this interesting stuff at the end to have a very bland and simple conclusion. The most obvious, oh, they're going to premiere the movie, everyone's going to laugh. And then Tommy Wiseau's going to go on the stage and go, I did it, I made a comedy on purpose, that was my intention, ha ha ha. I hate the fake laughing. They're clearly just like, they focus on all these people in the audience like, and they're just laughing nonstop for what, the last third of the movie? It's crazy. Like, even drunk people watching The Room don't laugh for the entire last third of The Room. The opening of this movie is awful as well. It starts with all these celebrities going, I wish I was on set to see The Room, and guys like J.J. Abrams going, I can't believe the emotional impact The Room has had on this culture. And why are we seeing this? Why does it matter what a bunch of dumb celebrities think of The Room? Who gives a shit? And again, it's the lack of focus of this movie, where they could have spent the entire last third of this movie really illustrating the cultural impact The Room had, and instead we're treated to a bunch of shit at the beginning of a bunch of dumb celebrities who mean nothing, going, oh my god, is this Room so good? And then there's just title cards at the end of the movie going, oh, and then they toured the movie and it made its money back. But, like, what? That's what you got here. You got a decent fan film. I say fan film, it could have been much worse with the fan service. It's not like they stopped the movie to have fan service, because they don't. This movie is edited pretty well and is very tight. I'll give it that. But you can't help but think, this could have been so much more. This could have been a great movie. This could have been best picture level stuff, which would have been so ironic. But instead what you got is a movie like The Founder or something, where it's solid. You learn a little bit, there's a great performance in it, it's decently made, you know, but aside from that, you don't really get anything out of it, and it doesn't try to do anything that different. You know, at the same time, this is a story that's so good it writes itself, you know? Like, you have to try really hard to mess up this really fascinating story. And they didn't mess it up. They told the story in a way that's very conventional, and I was like, okay, this is fine. This is a fine movie. Good for you, James. I really hope James gets a Best Actor nod in all these award ceremonies. If you want to see it, see it. If you want to know how The Room was made, go see it. If it looks funny to you, then go see it. It's a good comedy. I laughed a decent amount. But don't expect anything Best Picture level, because it isn't. And that's about it. Fine job, everybody. These things are cold now.